The first thing I want to do is just introduce myself. My field is the psychology of language. My background, my training is in developmental psychology and psycholinguistics, developmental psycholinguistics. My theoretical and empirical research attempts to critically situate cognitive linguistics within a sociocultural, semiotic approach to mind and language. And a very strong characteristic of my research, as you will see, is that my methods are interdisciplinary. My work belongs within what I shall call the situated, embodied, enactivist approach in cognitive science, which I will explain. The general name that I give to my theoretical and methodological commitments is the socio-naturalistic approach, which roughly translates as attempting to understand the phenomena of human language and the human mind from a perspective which integrates the biological with the socio-cultural. Here is a copy of a book I published 20 years ago, Language and Representation, a socio-naturalistic approach to human development. I expect a new edition of this book to come out next year. And because the picture was not very clear, I'm giving you here a photograph of the work of art that I used for the front cover of that book. It's a detail from a painting by Veronese, an Italian Renaissance painter, and this painting has different titles if you look for it on the internet, but one of the titles is The Dialectic, and the representation that you see here is my way of trying to understand the human understanding of the network of meaning within which we all live, the way that we reflexively reflect upon language and meaning as a kind of web which binds us together with each other, with other human beings, and a web which we can examine in order to foster our own cognitive creativity. My research interests are in language and cognitive development, in the semantics and typology of the language of space and time, in cross-linguistic and cross-cultural studies of cognition and human development, in evolutionary biology, cultural evolution and language evolution, and in cognitive semiotics, meaning and materiality. This last, I will say a little more about. There is now a new journal, and I am a member of the consulting editorial board, which is called Cognitive Semiotics. And this journal, Cognitive Semiotics, is, I think, can be regarded as an attempt to extend the program of cognitive linguistics away from just language, but to an examination of all meaning-based practices and sign-based phenomena in human cognition and human life. Now I'll give you an overview of this lecture. I'm going to talk about two opposing paradigms in cognitive science. I'm going to talk about different theoretical conceptions of the three terms which form the title of this lecture and which are central to this lecture series, namely language, culture, and mind. And I'm going to outline differing views of the relationships between them. And of course, I'm going to tell you what my view is as well. First of all, let's ask ourselves, what is cognitive science? In a way, we all know the answer, but I think it's worth going through it again. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. The disciplines involved in contemporary cognitive science are psychology, linguistics, artificial intelligence, philosophy, anthropology, and neuroscience, which is increasingly important. And we should note that neuroscience itself is also an interdisciplinary enterprise comprising different sciences of the brain. The term cognitive science started to be used in the late 1960s and more so in the 1970s. But in a way, the idea is older. And in my lecture this afternoon, I will be exploring some ways in which the ideas that inspire cognitive linguistics come from an older tradition in general psychology, which predates cognitive science. So we can ask ourselves, is cognitive science an inheritor of or a replacement for what used to be called general psychology, comprehending many sciences of the mind? And we can also ask ourselves, where do we stand now in cognitive science in the first decade of the 21st century? Some 40 years since people started to come up with the idea of a new cognitive science. I'm going to suggest to you that cognitive science is now the site of a contestation between two paradigms. These two paradigms are the classical paradigm and the new paradigm. The classical paradigm is often called rules and symbols cognitivism. And the new paradigm is a rather more diverse one, not so easily encapsulated, but I have given it the name situated, embodied, enactive cognition. The first difference I want to emphasize between these paradigms is that the classical cognitivism paradigm is formal and very much inspired by the formalist approach in linguistics, whereas the situated, embodied, enactive cognition, which I will henceforth call the new paradigm, is much more functional in its approach. Where the classical paradigm is nativist, the new paradigm, I claim, is based on epigenetic developmental principles, dynamic principles of development. Where the classical paradigm is modular, emphasizing separate processes for different domains of cognition, the new paradigm emphasizes general principles of learning and organization and dynamism. Whereas the classical paradigm is determinedly universalist, the new paradigm recognizes the importance of context and of particularity. Whereas the classical paradigm is monologic, situating its theories in the mind of individual speaker-hearers without much concern for the process of communication. The new paradigm is interactional and dialogic. Whereas the old paradigm is very much based upon linguistic theory and in particular formalist linguistics and is logocentric in the sense that it is oriented to word-like symbols. The new paradigm is multimodal emphasizing that communication is a matter of many media and of the whole body, whereas the classical paradigm is based upon methodological individualism, in which it is the individual Cartesian mind-brain which is the focus of attention. The situated embodied paradigm focuses on the extended and distributed mind. And whereas the classical paradigm looks at the disembodied mind, the new paradigm is based upon the notion of the embodied mind. And finally, because computational theories are an important part of cognitive science, we have to look at the different notions of computation which are current in these two paradigms. The classical paradigm, as many of you know, is based upon an algorithmic view of the manipulation of internal symbols, analogously to a computer program based on a von Neumann serial processing system. Whereas the new paradigm is very much inspired by connectionist neural network models of human cognition. So where does cognitive linguistics fit in these paradigms? I'm sure that you will all agree that cognitive linguistics rejects formalism and embraces a general functional perspective, which is why we often call it cognitive functional linguistics. However, it is my contention that some of its leading exponents retain some of the assumptions of classical cognitivism in regard to a number of issues, and in particular nativism, theoretical and methodological individualism, and the assumption that language reflects cognition without equally emphasizing that language actually transforms cognition. And it is on some of these issues that I will be trying to push forward the cognitive linguistics agenda in the coming lectures. In talking about the relationships between language, culture, and mind, we need to know what we are talking about. We need to define our terms. Let's start with language. For formalist approaches, and in particular, the approach of the early Chomsky, language is defined as an infinite set of sentences. More generally, language is conceived as a rule-governed system of symbols possessing the following features. Productivity, which means that the combinatorial rules enabling the generation or construction of novel legal sentences, or of an infinite set of legal sentences. So this is the rules which underlie the infinite set of sentences. And systematicity, which means, within this paradigm, the stability of symbolic value across lawful combinations. For example, we could take the two sentences, the lectures are in Beijing, and the lectures in Beijing take place in December. And we have to assume that each of these symbols entering into these different sentential strings have the same value. Otherwise, we would not be able to have a productive system in which meanings are stable across their combinations. For formalism, the issue of the stability of meaning is a problem. Why? Because formalist theories are syntax-driven. The rules determine the possible forms of legal combinations. For a formal description of language to hook up with the world, as we might say, a semantics is required that maps sentences in the language to objective states of affairs in the world, which is why Lakoff and others talk about the objectivist commitment of formalist linguistics. And this referential relationship has to be determinate. In other words, there must be a clear and unequivocal relationship between the sentence strings and states of affairs, and it must be objective. And the way that this is usually secured is by invoking the notion of truth as correspondence. And this leads to the hypothesis, or really it's not a hypothesis. I think for classical cognitivism we can say that it is an axiom. The axiom that the mind is to be considered as a syntactically driven machine whose state transitions satisfy semantical criteria of coherence. That's from the archpriest of classical cognitivism, Jerry Fodor, and his colleague Zenon Pilishin. Therefore, formalist theories require strict compositionality to account for systematicity. The meanings of legal combinations are built up from the meanings of their constituents. But there's a problem, for which formalism does have a solution. In fact, natural language expressions are difficult to characterize in terms of strict compositionality. Let's take those same two sentences. They seemed pretty okay to begin with. If we examine them more closely and we just highlight that little word in. In the two sentences, the lectures are in Beijing, and the lectures in Beijing take place in December. It becomes clear that of the three usages of in, of the three usages, there seem to be two different meanings of the word in. One referring to location and the other referring to time. And that is why formalist theories of language prefer to posit general meanings, very general abstract meanings, instead of recognizing the polysemy or many-meaningness of many natural language items, and the recognition of polysemy is, as a matter of fact, central to cognitive linguistics. But then, if we step up one level of abstraction, away from just the meanings of natural language to the meanings which have to be entertained by this syntactically driven machine in its entirety, then the general solution posited to the problem of meaning is the idea of a computational language of thought, which was first advanced by Jerry Fodor. And the language of thought is not a natural language. It's meant to be a universal language in which the thoughts of all human beings are internally represented, and natural language expressions are derived by some kind of translation mechanism from this language of thought. And the language of thought is completely unequivocal, monologic, and univocal. It doesn't have polysemy, ambiguity, and all of the rest of the messy stuff of natural language. So one of the amazing things about the classical cognitivist program is that from the start, it's taken us further and further away from the real world of language as people actually use it towards some kind of idealized mechanistic system existing in a strange formal universe, a rather cold and fleshless universe, we might say. But in any case, this language of thought is what anchors natural languages in the form of knowledge of language, or as Chomsky calls it, internal language. For Chomsky, it is the internal language which is primary, which takes precedence over the real language which is out there in the world, the language which you and I use to communicate with each other. Now let's contrast this with cognitive functional linguistics. For cognitive functional linguistics, languages are conventional simple systems enabling communication, conceptualization, and construal. The 3 C's, or the 4 C's, cognitive linguistics, is about communication, conceptualization, and construal. Languages, you will perhaps recognize this from Lanaka, are open inventories of symbolic assemblies at different levels of organization. That's our equivalent in cognitive linguistics to the idea of an infinite set of sentences, an open inventory of symbolic assemblies, but not one which is generated by some kind of mechanistic productivity process. And finally, languages are multi-level systems of mapping between linguistic conceptualization and linguistic expression. And this notion of a multi-level system of mapping is taken up in the work of, amongst others, Fauconnier, Lakoff, Lanaka, and Talmy, and others. Now, I'm not saying that these notions are without problems, and as a matter of fact, I think there are problems, which I will try to explore, and in particular, I will explore some of these problems tomorrow. But let's just take this as being a characterization of the very different idea of what language is in cognitive functional linguistics. So, those are 2 different ideas of what we might call language as a system. But now here's another view of language, another metaphor, if you like, for language. Language as a tool. Of course, language as a tool is a fundamental idea in all varieties of functionalism. Language is a tool whose form or structure is shaped by its use for communication. This is an idea which we find in the Prague School linguistics of Roman Jakobson, Mukurovsky, and others. We also find it in the theories of the great psychologist of language, Karl Bühler, who developed what he called the organon model of language and communication. Organon being the Greek word for tool. And we also find it in later variants of functionalist linguistics, such as those of Simon Dick and Talmy Givon. But language is not only a communicative tool. Language is also a tool for thought, which shapes cognition. And this is the notion of the semiotic mediation of cognition through signs and sign systems. This idea that human higher cognitive processes use the tool of language and signification to transform learning, memory, and all higher cognitive processes, we can find in the Western tradition as long ago as the French Enlightenment philosopher Condillac. Most famously in psychology, it gets taken up by the Russian psychologist Vygotsky. And the idea that this semiotic mediation in some kind of way shapes our cognitive processes, giving them form, we find in the work of the American linguists Wolf and Sapir. And we also find the notion of semiotic mediation in other ways, incidentally, in American pragmatist philosophy, but I won't go into that. So we've looked at language as a system, and we've looked at language as a tool. But there's more. Language is also a social institution. It's part of, if you like, the house of the mind. Because grammars are normative and conventional, and normativity and conventionality are hallmarks of human social institutions. There are rules for what you should do and what you shouldn't do. There are right and wrong ways of going about things. Before we move on from this, let me note something. For structuralism in the tradition of Saussure, the notion of conventionality gets confused, I would say, with the notion of arbitrariness. But not all conventions are arbitrary. Some of them are actually motivated. And one of the great virtues of cognitive functional linguistics is to point out that many phenomena in language, while being conventional, are nonetheless motivated by deep cognitive processes. In other words, that there is a reason for why language is that way. And this is part of a more general functional perspective within cognitive linguistics. Norms are intersubjectively shared rules that regulate conduct and are objects of common knowledge. This is a point which has been stressed by many times by my friend and colleague, linguist from Finland, Esa Itkonen. In other words, the rules of language or of any other normative system are the rules that we follow when we do things. They regulate conduct, but also they are rules to which we orientate in trying to understand and know them. They are objects of common knowledge, shared intersubjectively between people. And if that is the case, please note that knowledge of language is not identical to language. Contra Chomsky, against Chomsky's claim. Chomsky's claim is that language is knowledge of language. My claim is that there is language and there is knowledge of language. Because if we recognize that language is a social institution, we cannot say that the institution is the same as the knowledge of the institution. They are two different things. Think of it this way. There are the rules of football. In order to play football correctly, you have to know those rules. That is indisputable. But there is football, and there are the rules of football, and then there is knowledge of the rules of football. They're not all identical. Of course, football wouldn't exist if nobody knew its rules. But these rules exist in some way independently of the particular individual representations of any given person. Knowledge may vary inter-individually. Anybody, take football. Imagine a small kid comes in and joins a game which bigger kids are playing. The bigger kids know more of the rules than the smaller kid. But when he starts to play, he's still playing football, right? He's joining in. Think about that as a metaphor for language acquisition. Rules are shared between at least two people. And that's where something else important comes in, which is Wittgenstein's argument against the possibility of a private language. Wittgenstein said, it is not possible for somebody to just invent a private language which only they know. Because how would they know if they tried to remember the rules of that language, how would they know whether they were right or wrong? There would be nobody else around to correct them. That's one part of Wittgenstein's argument. But anyway, the point is that I'm using this to show that once we acknowledge that language is a social institution, the Chomskyan fiction that knowledge of language is the same as language itself, and that the internal language is the primary language, can be shown to be logically and methodologically completely false. Language is also a biosemiotic system and an ecological niche. This kind of notion may be less familiar to you, but it will be central to what I will be saying. First of all, language is a biologically grounded communication system. Now, as I will be saying tomorrow, there are many biologically grounded communication systems because in the natural world, the animal world, there are many ways of communicating and many systems for doing so. And all of them, of course, are biologically grounded in the sense that they are grounded in organism, in evolution, and in biological function. And language is no different. Language did not, as it were, descend from the sky to replace other biologically grounded communication systems. It emerged somehow out of non-linguistic or pre-linguistic biologically grounded communication systems. Language is a very special sort of communication system because it is a system of communicative signs that can be analyzed from the perspective of biosemiotics. As you probably know, semiotics is the study of signs and sign functions. And as a matter of fact, the specific characteristics of human natural language derive from the nature of the sign function, which is instantiated in natural language. Thirdly, language is a species-unique ecological niche that is absolutely fundamental to human culture. As we shall see, culture is not necessarily something that only humans have, but the kind of culture that we have, a culture which is dependent upon language for its transmission, for its day-to-day living, for its enactment, that is unique to humans. And it's a niche. All species exist in some kind of ecological niche, a system of constraints and supports that enable action. We are no different. But what is interesting and important about human beings is that language is a constituent and constitutive part of our human cultural niche. So language, I will submit to you, can be viewed as a biocultural niche. And the title of one of the later lectures in this series is Language as a Biocultural Niche and Social Institution, where I try to understand how it is that we can articulate those 2 points of view together. So much for now for language. What about culture? What is culture? Well, one thing we can say about culture is that it's something shared by one group, but not another group. It is about specificity, and it is about difference. For example, I can talk about British culture and I can talk about Chinese culture. And there wouldn't be any point in talking about those two cultures at that level of analysis if there weren't interesting differences between British and Chinese culture, which make them British culture and Chinese culture. Or I can step up to another, more abstract level of analysis in a way that I just was doing, and I can talk about human culture, in which case I am probably contrasting it to some other culture of some other species. In any case, culture is always about sharing, and it is always about difference, which is what makes it so intriguing. And of course, one of the aspects of difference is that this difference can be viewed both positively and negatively. It's a dangerous topic in that sense. What else? So what is it that is actually shared by one group that we call a cultural group? Well, one way of thinking about this is its ways of doing things, different kinds of practices. Practices which may be to do with communication, or maybe to do with making things, or anything under the sun. Practices. But it's also to do with ways of thinking. Mental models, schemas, and worldviews. Culture is also ways of, at least human cultures, are also ways of talking, discourses, the way in which we talk about things of significance to us. Now to me, it's not important to say that one or other of these things, ways of doing things, ways of thinking, and ways of talking, is the correct way of defining culture. In fact, they're all correct ways of defining culture. They're all part of this package that we call culture, the different aspects of it. And while we're at it, we can also say that at another level of analysis, we can talk about high and low cultures, subcultures, and so on. There is no kind of final end to the granularity at which we may analyze culture. Cultures can be microcultures. We can talk about the culture, for example, of an organization. We can talk about the culture of Beihang University, or we can talk about the particular culture of a profession or a working group or a sports club. You name it. That's why in recent years anthropologists who study culture have become very interested in such local and specific forms of culture. Now I'm going to give you two more answers to the question, what is culture? The first is what I call the human science answer. Culture as a pattern or patterns of meaning. Culture is definitely about meaning, which is thematized in some way by a stock of narratives. Cultures are often about stories, the stories that we tell about us, stories that we tell about others. But these narratives are accompanied by other kinds of thematizers which express and organize cultural identity, such as rituals, myths, icons, and emblems. Culture is a normative order, that word again, realized and reproduced in semiotic systems or vehicles, including language, and in enduring artifacts and institutions, and enacted and renewed in social and communicative practices. Culture is also not just about cognition. It's about the binding of cognition and affect in specific space-time configurations the here and now bits of culture which count for the members of the culture, the things that make them feel as well as understand, and which could be called, after the cultural theorist Raymond Williams, structures of feeling. And finally, culture is not opposed to nature, but linked to and interfaced to nature by conventions which canalize and partially govern the reproduction in action of the cultural symbolic order, something about which I will have more to say. A second answer to the question, what is culture? A biological science answer. Culture is about intra-species group differences, that is, differences inside the species, within a single species, in behavioral patterns and repertoires. These differences are not directly determined by ecological circumstances, such as the availability of particular resources employed in the differing behavioral repertoires. So, for example, if we take two groups of non-human primates, and we find that they have different ways of, for example, foraging for a certain food, then we couldn't say it's a cultural difference if only one of them's got that kind of food available in their habitat. But if both of them have got the same food, but they have different ways of finding it and doing things with it, that's a cultural difference. And these differences have to be learned and transmitted across generations. They shouldn't be genetically transmitted. And two very important examples, which I shall call upon in these lectures, are primate tool use, but not just tool use, by the way, also just feeding patterns, stuff like that. And birdsong, interestingly, on that criterion, turns out to be a cultural phenomenon. So on the biological definition of what is culture, humans are definitely not the only species to have culture. It turns out that culture is much more widespread in the animal kingdom than has previously been thought. And that is important. It's important because, look, way back at the time of the European Enlightenment, and perhaps this has been true in reflection on these matters in other cultural traditions as well, it has often been supposed that we get the human mind, the human language, and human culture all as a package, you know? That we're the only ones with a mind, we're the only ones with language, and we're the only ones with culture. But it may be a package for us, but if we look more widely, it's not a package. These things are rather more widespread: cognition, culture, and language. Let's ask now, what is a cultural approach within psychology? And I'll give you an answer. It includes, but is not identical with, cross-cultural psychology as a method. It focuses on what the cultural psychologist Jan Valsener calls the systemic and dynamic nature of culture in psychology and psychology in culture. It is about the semiotic mediation of higher cognitive processes, and it is about situated learning and cognition, culturally situated. And very frequently, cultural psychology takes off using a historical developmental perspective derived from Vygotsky, who was the main founder of cultural historical psychology. What about cultural linguistics? What's that? We can go back a long way here to the great American originally German actually, but then later American anthropologist and linguist Franz Boas, and he said this: the purely linguistic inquiry, in other words, just looking at language, is part and parcel of a thorough investigation of the psychology of the peoples of the world. By the way, that apostrophe there shouldn't be there. It is meant to be a plural, peoples. But note that plural. He really did mean peoples in the plural. He really did mean the way in which psychology might conceivably vary between different cultures and languages. And he probably took this idea from one of the founding fathers of psychology as a discipline, Wilhelm Wundt, who is usually credited in the history books with founding the very first psychological laboratory in Leipzig in 1870-something, but devoted much of his life to writing about what we would now call cultural psychology, which he called Völkerpsychologie, the psychology of peoples. Bringing us more up to date, we have another quote. Cultural linguistics is concerned with most of the same domains of language and culture as Boasians, as the linguists who followed Boas in the first part of the last century. It assumes a perspective which is essentially cognitive. And this is a quote from Gary Palmer, who is a cognitive linguist and cultural linguist. And he says, linguistic meaning is subsumed within worldview, by which he means the assembly of cultural schemas. And what Palmer is saying there is something very important. He's saying that linguistic meanings are only part of the meanings by which we live, as it were, and that linguistics, like psychology, needs to be situated in a cultural context. And he is a real pioneer of this study. So, we've done language, we've done culture. What about mind? Here are some varieties of mind currently on offer in the market of cognitive science. The classical cognitivist mind is the computational and representational mind, as represented by theorists such as Fodor, Johnson-Laird, and Jackendorf. The embodied mind, as represented by Varela, Thompson and Rush, and Lakoff and Johnson. The extended and distributed mind, about which I will say a bit more in a minute, represented by philosophers such as Merleau-Ponty, psychologists in the tradition of Vygotsky, philosophers, contemporary philosophers like Andy Clark, and cognitive anthropologists such as Ed Hutchins. The discursive and dialogic mind, in the tradition of the Russian linguist and literary theorist Bakhtin, the psychologist Rom Haré, and Ivana Markova, and the psychologist James Wirch. Finally, for now, the shared mind in the tradition of phenomenologists such as Husserl, the philosophy of the later Wittgenstein, and psychologists such as Colwyn Trevathan. On the topic of the shared mind, I'll say a little bit more later. Let's go back here to talk about the extended and distributed mind, okay? The idea of the extended and distributed mind is that embodiment itself is extended, and the term that I use for this, logically enough, is extended embodiment. One of my favorite psychologists, Jerry Bruner, long ago, in 1966. He was one of the first people in cognitive science to take the idea of cultural situatedness seriously. And he wrote, "It is always difficult for the psychologist to think of anything existing in a culture. We are, alas, wedded to the idea that human reality exists within the limiting boundary of the human skin." Brunner directed that barb, that criticism, against his fellow psychologists. But I would suggest to you that actually the same criticism could be also addressed to some cognitive linguists, such as Lakoff and Johnson, who talk about embodiment as if the primary reality was essentially that which takes place within the skin of the individual, or even more radically, just within the brain. And here is a quote from the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, which I think expresses beautifully the idea of extended embodiment. "The body is our general medium for having a world. Sometimes the meaning aimed at cannot be achieved by the body's natural means. It must then build itself an instrument, and it projects thereby around itself a cultural world." In a way, what Merleau-Ponty is saying here is that we have two natures. The nature which is given to us organismically in our bodies, but also the human nature that we create for ourselves, the nature that we construct in the construction of culture. And here's a quote, a rather lengthy one, which I've broken down into paragraphs from an article that I wrote, which is about everyday artifacts, the kinds of things that we find all around us in this room, which is itself an artifact. Everyday artifacts are not culturally neutral, not just in the sense that they may be more or less familiar to individuals from different cultures, but also because they embody different conceptualizations or cultural schemas. This extended embodiment does not exist in a vacuum. It is not, as it were, a property of the objects in themselves. Rather, it is constituted and exemplified by the participation of the objects in an entire matrix of cultural practices, some of which are linguistic or discursive practices, and some of which are non-linguistic. Furthermore, cultural schemas find a further manifestation or expression in the lexico-grammatical structures of natural languages. And it is from this perspective perhaps no surprise that children should be so adept, as Bowerman and her colleagues have shown, in acquiring the specific conceptualization expression mappings of their mother tongue. And I will return to these issues in lectures 5 and 6. I mentioned above the notion of the shared mind, and at this point I will just do a little advertisement for a book that came out this year, of which I am one of the co-editors, called The Shared Mind, Perspectives on Intersubjectivity, from John Benjamin's. And it's an interdisciplinary volume which brings together work by linguists, psychologists, philosophers, primatologists. So let me now take up this notion of intersubjectivity. It will be important to what I say, because I consider intersubjectivity intersubjectivity to be as crucial for cognitive linguistics as subjectivity. Cognitive linguists have often emphasized the importance of the subjective perspective, which is correct, and I don't wish to argue with. But it is also important to emphasize the critically central nature of intersubjectivity, that is, perhaps slightly more generally, the shared meanings and sense of community engendered by participation in joint action and interaction by subjects. And at that point, that leads me to just signal another important notion which will arise later on in the lectures, which is the very notion of participation. Here are how the anthropologist and linguist spousal pair, a husband and wife team of the Goodwins, define participation thus: actions demonstrating forms of involvement performed by parties within evolving structures of talk. So they use they come from a perspective which tries to integrate anthropology and conversation analysis. They then go on to say, we need to expand our notion of human participation in a historically built social and material world by attending to material structure in the environment, which I will also be doing. So we've looked at notions of language, culture, and mind. Now let's look at their relationships or interrelationships. Let's think about mind and language, and let's return to the first paradigm that we identified, classical cognitivism. Formalist cognitivism views language as a sort of imperfect printout of the internal processes taking place in the computational representational mind. Why is it an imperfect printout, not a perfect one? Well, because the human mind is resource limited. It doesn't have sufficient working memory resources, etc., to give a perfect printout. So you have to do a lot of inference to figure out what's really going on behind there in the representational mind. But let's call it the printout metaphor. And this is the basis of Chomsky's distinction between competence and performance. The printout is the performance with all its resource limitations, limited channel capacity, limited working memory, blah, blah. But behind it, there is competence, and it's the linguist's job to figure out what that competence is. Generalize that across everything, and you've got classical cognitivist view of mind and language. And this view is closely linked to Chomsky's argument from the poverty of the stimulus, which I am not going to rehearse here. I'm sure that many of you know it, and anyway, I don't really have time, and it's not my job to do Chomsky's work for him. But the argument from the poverty of the stimulus leads from this view of mind and language to the conclusion about the mind, that it's characterized by innateness, modularity, and the encapsulation of different processes, one from another. And this has been extended by Fodor to include not just syntax, but also semantics, or the language of thought that which we encountered earlier, as well as universal grammar. A completely and totally different, in fact converse view of the relationship between mind and language we find in the work of linguistic relativists such as Worf and Sapir. Linguistic relativity is expressed thus: it posits difference. Here's a quote from Woolf, a well-known one. Users of markedly different grammars are pointed by their grammars toward different types of observations, and hence different evaluations of externally similar acts of observation, and hence are not equivalent as observers, but must arrive at somewhat different views of the world. Well, you can see he was somehow influenced by and perhaps trying to create a parallel with the theory of relativity in physics. But the basic idea is that languages create different perspectives on the world, and that the users of different language, and these different perspectives are entrenched in grammars, as we would now say in cognitive linguistics, and that consequently the users of different languages have different worldviews. But interestingly, that was not all that Woolf said, because he didn't actually believe that there was nothing that humans had in common at all when it came to worldview or perception of the world, because he also said that there was a kind of universality as well. And he said, Gestalt psychology gives us a canon of reference for all observers, irrespective of their languages or scientific jargons, by which to break down and describe all visually observable situations and many other situations as well. So the relativist Woolf, amazingly enough, did believe that there was at least one theory that was going to be useful in trying to explain similarities as well as differences between different languages and their users. And the theory that he landed upon was Gestalt psychology, which I will be talking about this afternoon. I think it's this afternoon or tomorrow, I can't remember. And which has been central to cognitive linguistics. So the question is, how can these universalistic and relativistic perspectives be reconciled? A question which I will try to answer. Now let's look at Piaget, who I hope many of you have heard of, another great developmental psychologist. For Piaget, also, cognition has priority over language. Language is a kind of expression of cognition. So he emphasizes the priority of cognition over language. He considered that the basis of all cognition is sensory motor intelligence, defined as the structured coordination of action and perception. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like cognitive linguistics. Piagetian theory can therefore be considered as a forerunner of modern theories of the basis of cognition in perception, action, linkages and circuits, including the importance of mimetic or imitative linkages underpinned by mirror neurons. Piaget, who of course was a developmental psychologist, considered that language is a manifestation of symbolic thought, occurring with the emergence of what he called the semiotic function towards the end of the second year of human life. He believed that language does not transform thought, it merely expresses increasingly complex modes of coordination of action. Piaget was an important precursor of cognitive linguistics, but it also has to be said that he underemphasized the significance of imagery in schematization, because basically he thought that action was the key to cognition. But conversely, cognitive linguists often underemphasize the importance of development and of the semiotic basis of language, which Piaget did recognize. Now Vygotsky, who I've mentioned before, what was his view of the relationship between mind and language? Here is the most famous and most widely cited quotation from Vygotsky, who was also, of course, a developmental psychologist. Every function in the child's development appears twice. First on the social level, and later on the individual level. First, between people, interpsychological, and then inside the child, intrapsychological. All the higher functions, by which he means the higher cognitive functions, by which he means memory, reasoning, and language, all the higher functions originate as actual relations between human individuals. Now, Vygotsky, it's worth pointing out that he took some of his inspiration from the work of Condillac and a French psychologist called Janet, but he also was a Marxist psychologist who was attempting to understand the social basis of cognition as well as its symbolic basis. Another key notion in Vygotsky's psychology was the zone of proximal development. And this is what he said about the zone of proximal development and children's learning. It's the difference or gap between what the child can achieve by independent activity and problem solving and what she or he can accomplish with the help of a more competent person. Actually, I don't think that's a quote from Vygotsky, but it's a good definition of the zone of proximal development. And the key here is that language plays both in the general process of internalizing social and communicative relations as cognitive structures, and in the process of advancing the child through the zone of proximal development. A key role is played by language, which is the medium of communication and of cognitive transformation. Vygotsky believed that all higher cognitive functions were semiotically mediated, and that the internalization of cultural forms of behavior involves the reconstruction of psychological activity on the basis of sign operations. And as an example of that, he used the example of a knot in a child's handkerchief, which the child uses as an aide-memoire, as a kind of cue for memory. And well, I don't know whether in China this is or was a widespread cultural custom. It certainly isn't any longer where I come from in Britain, but believe it or not, I am old enough to remember this particular little device, which is basically you go to school and your mum gives you a handkerchief, and if you've got to take a message to the teacher, she ties a knot in the handkerchief to remind you that you've got to give that message to the teacher. Yeah? Well, nobody takes handkerchiefs, not cloth handkerchiefs, to school anymore, but they probably put a message on the mobile phone or something. But anyway, Vygotsky's point was, this little knot in the handkerchief is a sign. The handkerchief is no longer just a functional thing, for blowing your nose or wiping your nose. The handkerchief now has got a semiotic function, or at least the knot in it has a semiotic function. And this semiotic function transforms the child's memory. And he just used that as a little example of a universal and complex process of the semiotic transformation of higher cognitive processes under the influence of cultural practices. So for Vygotsky, culture consists of embodied practice involving a relationship between externalization and internalization, in which human cognition is embodied not just in the body, but in the products of material and symbolic culture, tools, artifacts, and signs. And the developing human being internalizes or appropriates the use of these products by way of guidance by or apprenticeship to adults. And Jerry Bruner uses for this process the metaphor of scaffolding. The scaffolding by the adult of the learning by the child. Another interesting point from Vygotsky is the analogy he draws, which we shall return to later in these lectures, between sign use and tool use. And here is a quote from Vygotsky. The analogy between sign and tool use rests on the mediating function that characterizes each of them. But the tool is externally oriented, by which Vygotsky means it's oriented to the transformation of the material world, yes? While the sign is internally oriented. It's oriented, what he means by that, it's oriented towards the transformation of our inner mental, cognitive and conscious world. The use of artificial means, the transition to mediated activity, fundamentally changes all psychological operations. Higher psychological function is the combination of tool and sign in psychological activity. That's Vygotsky's whole theory in a nutshell. He also said, or claimed, that human development involved the merging of two lines of development. And he actually called them the natural and the cultural lines of development, but I don't like those terms. And I've relabeled those two paths of development to bring them more into line with, as it were, the sort of usage that we might talk about in cognitive linguistics. You have sensory motor development, the development of the embodied organism as an individual organism, and you have pre-linguistic communication. And where those two meet, says Vygotsky, you get language, or I will say you get symbolic communication. And in one of my later lectures, and I think it's tomorrow, I will try and give a more extended account of how that occurs and how we might think about language evolution as well in this perspective. Well, I've taken you on a trip around theories and approaches to language, culture, and mind. What conclusions can we draw so far? Very few, without further evidence, of course. Still, we can discern some broad dimensions that distinguish the classical cognitivist or formalist program from all the others that we have discussed. And that's why my work is very much about trying to integrate the cognitive functional approach in linguistics with the socio-cultural and developmental approaches in psychology that I've been talking about, including Piaget, including Vygotsky. And I'll conclude by delineating these broad differences between formalism and functionalism as two views of language, communication, and learning. For formalism, language is a formal system of rules and symbols. Communication is about the transmission of ideas from one individual head to another individual head. And learning is the internalization of the system of rules and symbols on the basis of linguistic input. Whereas for functionalism, language is a semiotic vehicle and a cognitive tool. Communication is symbolic action in an intersubjective field, and learning is situated, embodied, and socially scaffolded. I think this is my last slide. It's about autonomy versus holism. Formalist theories emphasize the autonomy of syntax from meaning, as you know, and they view lexical semantics, and they only really talk about lexical semantics, as only trivially culturally variable. For formalist theories, language is autonomous from culture. It doesn't really have anything to do with culture. On the other hand, functionalist theories definitely recognize universal motivations, universal functional motivations for linguistic structure. But viewing language as a part of symbolic culture, functionalist theories also leave open a space for culturally determined cross-linguistic variation. In other words, culture, language, and mind for functionalists are not really three separate domains, but need to be studied in their holistic interaction. And that's where I will leave the lecture for today. Thank you very much.